Day 523 and the conflict in Ukraine continues with no end in sight. Hello, I'm Anton Fedyashin and this is The Heat. Ukraine's president is warning that his country will take the conflict directly to Russia. That's after a drone attack in Moscow. No one has claimed responsibility, and the Russian President Vladimir Putin has expressed guarded openness to an African peace initiative, while Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev talks about the possible use of a nuclear weapon if the Ukrainian counter-offensive is successful. Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Anton Fedyashin is a Russian affairs analyst and history professor at American University. Klaus Larres is a European affairs analyst and professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Also with us is Sergio Kudelia. He's an associate professor of political science at Baylor University. And Dmitry Babbich is a Russian journalist and political analyst. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Dmitry Babbich, Russia says it is reinforcing its air defenses after a wave of drone strikes. Officials say 3 Ukrainian drones, these are Russian officials saying this, 3 Ukrainian drones targeting Moscow were shot down. Ukraine has not taken any responsibility, as I said, but this is what President Zelensky had to say. Let's listen.
Today is the 522nd day of the so-called special military operation, which the Russian leadership expected to last for a week or two. Ukraine is getting stronger. Gradually, the war is returning to the territory of Russia, to its symbolic centers and military bases. This is an inevitable, natural, and absolutely fair process.
So, Dmitry, for weeks we've been hearing that this conflict is at something of a stalemate, but are we now going to see a serious escalation?
Well, I hope we won't see a serious escalation, but of course nothing can be excluded, especially if such statements are made there. I think the best solution is to start some kind of talks, to look for some kind of compromise as soon as possible. But obviously the Ukrainian forces are unable to deliver this so-called counter-offensive. It is absolutely, obviously not as successful as expected by the West. So they try to compensate for the lack of good news from the front line by these drone attacks against Moscow and more often against Crimea. And of course, these drone attacks will not force the Russian government to make any more concessions. I think it's a very erroneous assessment of the mood in Moscow. And in general, I think there were 2 big mistakes made during all of this tragedy. First, Russia escalated in February 2022. It escalated the war that actually started in 2014 and was started by the Kiev regime. And now, after the attempt in March last year to have some kind of peaceful talks in Istanbul, Russia and Ukraine were very close to a peaceful settlement, and then the West decided to strive for Ukraine's victory. That was the second fatal move, which made the situation as bad as it is now.
Sergio Kudelia, what do you make of those comments by President Zelensky? I mean, are we going to see more Ukrainian attacks against Russia?
Yes, and these attacks, of course, began not yesterday, but the attacks against Russian targets in Russia began last year, and the Ukrainian officials already accepted the responsibility for the attack on the Crimean Bridge last August. And many other attacks have been conducted since then. We also remember a raid by the Russian forces, the Special Legion that was organized in Ukraine on the Russian territory, and the capture of some parts of territory within Russia. These attacks do not have, are not intended to persuade Russian government to negotiate. They have primarily a symbolic significance, and the target of these attacks is Russian public opinion. They are meant to demonstrate the weakness of the Russian defenses. If the Ukrainian drones are capable of attacking Moscow, the business center of Moscow, the Kremlin, then it means that no one in Russia is secure and safe, and that the Russian defenses are very weak. So the ultimate goal of these attacks is to persuade the Russian public opinion that this type of a war, if it escalates, it will affect everyone. Every citizen of Russia will have to pay a price.
And Sergio, what do you make of Prime Minister Medvedev's threats on the use of nuclear weapons?
Again, these are not new threats. These threats have been voiced already last year in April and May. And as we know, this is the last resort that the Russian officials believe they can use in order to deter the West from supporting Ukraine militarily. But these were completely ineffective. And as we know, the West has been providing more and more advanced weaponry to Ukraine, and these nuclear threats are viewed as a bluff.
Anton Fedyashin, what is your assessment of the conflict right now and of Sergei's view that these attacks on Russian targets inside Russia are symbolic and meant to influence Russian public opinion?
And I think what we've heard from both Dmitry and Sergei is not mutually exclusive and correct. And I agree with Sergei's idea that these attacks are first and foremost meant to affect public opinion. But there's also a very important side to this truth, which is that this is about narrative and publicity. It does not change the strategic balance. And the real story, of course, is what's going on the front lines of the special military operation, the conflict. And there, remember, we have been talking about the looming, much expected, I can go on quoting Western sources, the counteroffensive, and the counteroffensive has failed to deliver any important results. As a matter of fact, nowhere on the front line have the Ukrainians actually reached the first of three lines of defense. There's also another important context to the strikes against Russian targets, specifically in Moscow, of course, lately, which is that the Russians are carrying out massive missile strikes against Ukraine all over the country, not just in one specific city or one specific region, but from the west to the north to the south to the east. So the disbalance, the disproportion is still enormous. It is still on Russia's side. So publicity is one thing, but wars aren't won with publicity. I've always said from the very beginning that wars are highly contingent, very difficult to predict. That is still true. But the sustainability of the actual fighting on the front lines and the massive amounts of airstrikes seems to be on Russia's side for the time being.
Anton, on that question of trying to influence Russian public opinion with these strikes, could Russian opinion go in one of two ways? On the one hand, it could force a rethink on the part of the Russian public and their support for this conflict. On the other hand, could it not also tighten Russian public resolve in this war against Ukraine?
Yes, of course it can. And that's how public opinion works. Public opinion, like war, is also contingent and quite often unpredictable. But so far, I have not seen a shred of evidence that Russian public opinion is turning against the war. As a matter of fact, understandably, as we saw happen with Ukrainian public opinion, even among Ukrainians who were pro-Russian, or at least more rather than less critical of Vladimir Zelensky's government before February of last year. So far, public opinion has actually consolidated closed ranks, and I see no sign so far that it is about to change or is changing.
Klaus Larres, we are hearing here in the United States, as well as in Ukraine, that the counteroffensive is not going as well as Ukraine had hoped. In fact, Ukraine says, now it says that it's making very slow but steady gains. Where do you think this conflict is going?
Well, that's difficult to say. You're right, the counteroffensive hasn't been as successful as a lot of people in the West expected, as Zelensky himself expected. One can't say that it has been unsuccessful because it's still ongoing. We have to wait and see, but it certainly is making much slower progress than expected. Above all, Russian mines, massive, millions of Russian mines have been laid in the territory where the Ukrainians are attacking, and that is slowing down the Ukrainian forces. What we see at the moment seems to be once again a stalemate. No side really makes any decisive progress. The Ukrainians, I understand, have recaptured 200 square kilometers of territory. That sounds a lot, but it isn't really, considering that the offensive has now been going on for a couple of weeks. And they want to get to the Black Sea to divide the Crimea Peninsula from the rest of Russia. Whether they will achieve that at the moment, that is questionable. So at the moment, we see a stalemate. Therefore, perhaps there is hope that the current negotiations, or the negotiations which will take place in Saudi Arabia in a week's time, that they will lead to something. However, Russia is not participating in these talks, and therefore these can only be preliminary discussions with perhaps a constructive peace plan being tabled afterwards.
Just one other point, Klaus, on the Saudi Arabian peace talks. The peace talks, as you pointed out, Russia will not be there. The United States will be there. China will be there. Well, they've been invited. We don't know whether they'll be there. India will be there. Some European countries will be there as well. It is based on the 10-point Ukrainian peace plan, which calls for a complete withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine, as well as payment of reparations. Is that a good starting point?
Well, it is a starting point. Whether it will be the solution or the final proposal will probably have to be very different, because you want to bring Russia to the table as well. Also, the prosecution of war criminals and of those people who started the war, clearly Putin himself, is included in that peace plan. This is clearly unrealistic, at least at this point. Therefore, I would expect that the negotiations, which have actually started in Copenhagen a month ago, will continue in Saudi Arabia in a week's time, so that perhaps a proposal for at least to bring Russia to the table, to start constructive talks with Russia as well, that will be the end of that Saudi Arabian peace proposal, peace plan. Whether that is realistic, we don't know. At the moment, it doesn't look as if Putin is prepared at all or interested in joining any negotiations at all.
Dmitry Babich, these peace proposals coming from Saudi Arabia, as Klaus has pointed out, Russia is not going to be at the table. It's not been invited. But there was a statement from the Kremlin spokesperson who said that although Russia won't be there, they will be watching developments very closely in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. What does that tell us?
Well, Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman for the Kremlin, belongs to the so-called peace party in Russia. So he's never rude with the West. He always keeps saying that we are open to dialogue. And I think he's sincere when he says it. But of course, Russia will not go to the negotiations which presuppose Russia's defeat, basically, the payment of reparations, the return of the territory, and much worse, the return of the people who live on that territory. There are already several million people in Crimea, in Donetsk, in Lugansk, in Zaporizhia region, who liaised with their destinies, their lives with Russia. So to leave them behind and give them to the Kiev regime, that would be really a terrible crime against humanity, because the Ukrainian government is very cruel to anyone who objects to Mr. Zelensky's opinions. Yeah. He shut down television channels, and that was the easy punishment for television journalists. but with the people who are connected, who liaise their lives with Russia, of course, he will be more cruel.
Dmitry,
so these are not peace negotiations. We have not even started negotiations about negotiations. That has to be done.
Yeah.
What we see in Copenhagen, what we saw in Copenhagen, what we will see in Saudi Arabia, I'm sorry, but these are not talks.
Okay.
This is just one of the sides.
And one other point, Dmitry, and very briefly, if you can, Ukraine says that it is negotiating with the United States on some kind of security guarantees pending full NATO membership. Do you see any kind of scenario where Russia will agree to any kind of peace settlement without some kind of firm Ukrainian neutrality assurance?
No, I think neutrality is a basic requirement. And of course, Russia will not agree to Ukraine joining NATO. Basically, I agree with Sergio that maybe the strikes against Moscow are targeting Russian public opinion. But if they want to scare Russians, then this is a counterproductive strategy, because this plays into the hands of President Putin. Putin has been saying that Ukraine, especially Ukraine inside NATO, will be a threat to Russia, that Ukraine is already a threat to Russia because it's a de facto NATO state. So attacking Moscow by drones or sending this so-called Russian Legion, which just killed a few civilians, this is a counterproductive strategy, because it proves to the Russians that what they heard from Putin is right, that this is the truth.
Sergio Kudelia, President Putin has expressed some openness, as it was put, to the peace proposals made by the African delegation. And if we look at these peace proposals, they're proposing a Russian troop pullback, removal of Russian nuclear weapons from Belarus, suspension of the International Criminal Court warrant against President Putin, and some sanctions relief. President Putin says it could form the basis for a deal. What do you think?
Yes, I'm in general very skeptical about the types of agreements that have been reached during the summit. If you just look at the declaration of the Russia-Africa summit, you would see no mention of Ukraine in that declaration. There is no mention about any possible negotiations or peace deals to resolve or to stop the war in Ukraine. So the fact that it did not enter into a formal document, to me, indicates that might have been preliminary discussions, and certainly the provisions that you just mentioned would be acceptable to Vladimir Putin. But this is not something that could be formalized in any manner as a result of negotiations.
Anton, we're hearing of so many different scenarios of what could happen in Ukraine. There was one that I was watching over the weekend. This was an interview that the American journalist Aaron Maté did with the University of Chicago professor John Mearsheimer, and they were talking about what could be taking place in Ukraine now. And this is Mearsheimer's view. He says that he foresees Russia taking over more Ukrainian territory, another 4 oblasts, he said, and continuing to destabilize Ukraine, or what would be rump Ukraine, effectively meaning that it will not join NATO, and there would be a state of permanent conflict. What do you make of that?
John Mearsheimer is possibly the most influential realist, geopolitical realist thinker, and unfortunately, the grim realist in me agrees with a lot, not everything, but much of what he says. He's not the only person to suggest that unless a peace deal is struck, the Russians will simply continue to slowly move into Ukrainian territory, which they are actually doing even now. With the Ukrainian counteroffensive stalled and the Ukrainians suffering massive loss of vehicles, which is abundantly documented over the past month and a half, soon to be 2 months actually, of the counteroffensive. The Russians are quietly but slowly moving in the northeastern frontier towards Kupiansk and Liman, and they're seizing more and more Ukrainian territory. The part the Ukrainians have managed to retake in the south are mostly empty fields and abandoned villages. The longer this lasts, the longer this war of attrition lasts, the weaker Ukraine will become. I do not agree. I think it was someone who said that Ukraine is becoming, it was Zelensky saying Ukraine is getting stronger. I'm not seeing that. Both sides are burning through their resources, but the Russians simply have more resource to burn. So the sooner the actual talks begin, the better. The problem is that President Zelensky signed a decree forbidding himself, obviously, and any other Ukrainian politician, representative, to conduct talks with Russia. The Ukrainians will have to overcome that decree and actually begin to have constructive talks with the Russians, who are also not going to approach them as the losing side because they haven't lost yet. So both sides are going to have to give, but unfortunately, this will be most painful for the Ukrainians. So let's see what comes out of Jeddah, but without the Russians there, I don't expect any breakthrough. But negotiations about negotiations, quite possible.
Okay, so hey, let me get a brief response from you on what Professor Mearsheimer said about there being continuous conflict in Ukraine as a way of preventing the country from becoming a member of NATO, essentially permanent conflict.
Yes, it is realistic option that this will be a long-term war, which will go escalate at certain points, de-escalate at other points, but we're not going to see a permanent resolution, just like we have not seen a permanent resolution on the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah.
But I want to add something to what Dr. Fedyashin said.
Yeah.
Zelensky's reference to stronger Ukraine was primarily meant to show that Ukraine now has unprecedented support from the West. And the resources that Ukraine is burning are not really resources of Ukraine, but these are mainly resources of the Western states. And the resolve that the West have shown to continue supporting Ukraine, this is essentially the security guarantees, I think challenges the assumption that Russia can overplay Ukraine over the long term.
Okay. Klaus Larres, at the Russia-Africa summit, President Putin took aim at the West. This is what he had to say. Let's listen.
Our Western partners have forgotten how they acted in Iraq, destroying the statehood of that country, and in the end eliminated Saddam Hussein. They have forgotten how they acted in Libya without any UN Security Council decision. They forgot that they destroyed the situation in Sudan. They forgot that they invaded Syria. They don't give a damn about the UN Charter. They remember international law only when they think that these instruments can be used against someone, in this case Russia. It's not going to work. It's too primitive. If they want someone to abide by the UN Charter and other norms of international law, let them themselves try and abide by those same norms of law.
So, Klaus, does President Putin have a point there when he says that it seems that the rules-based order that's often invoked by the West is only invoked when it suits them?
Well, every big power is to some extent hypocritical. This is very correct. But to listen to Putin talking about the global order and the rules-based world is a little ridiculous. Now, who invaded Crimea in 2014? Who invaded only recently in February 2022 Ukraine, and with a prehistory to that conflict? And of course, it was Putin who was behaved very brutally in the Syrian war and in African countries, and so on and so on. So Putin is definitely not the right person to talk about law and order and global rules. But perhaps I can say something about Zelensky and Putin. Zelensky is, of course, playing up his strengths. Of course, he wants to demonstrate to the West and to his own people that Ukraine is becoming stronger and stronger. Whether or not that is correct, we don't really know. But there was nothing like the Prigozhin coup, which we saw against Putin in Russia in Ukraine. We actually don't know how strong Putin's rule in Russia is. And of course, he has 3 to 4 million more people he can recruit to young men to the armed forces of Russia than Zelensky can. And and Russia is a much stronger country with many more resources. This is all pretty clear. But how insecure Putin really is, how unstable his rule internally in the Kremlin is, this is very much an open question. And we shouldn't overlook that and pretend that he is firmly in power and a stable, solid leader. He is clearly not. Otherwise, we wouldn't have seen a coup against him. Then perhaps one word, as Mr. Bush, as my Russian colleague said, I don't understand why Ukraine would be a danger to Russia. It is the other way around. Russia has proven to be a danger to Ukraine. Ukraine, whether it is a member of NATO or not, would not be a threat to Russia. Poland is a member of NATO and has never been a threat to Russia recently, nor have been the Baltic states. So I think we should not interpret recent history through the eyes of Putin.
Yeah, let me get a quick response from Dmitry Babich. Dmitry, I've only got less than a minute left, but to those points that Klaus made, that what can you tell us about President Putin's standing in the Kremlin, his security there, his stability there?
Well, Prigozhin had no chance. Everyone understood it, and this so-called coup showed consolidation over all political forces in Russia. As for the threat from Ukraine, please look at the newspapers. Poroshenko said that we want to get missiles that would be able to hit Russia. Ukraine, if you look at it, the border is very close to Moscow. Estonia is tens of miles from St. Petersburg. And of course, the West has been calling Russia a threat long before 2014, when it was proclaimed officially by NATO. And of course, NATO and the United States started breaking international law much earlier than Russia. Iraq, Yugoslavia, they all happened before, long before Ukraine and Crimea.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.